Can I welcome you all to this seventh, I think it is, meeting of the Environmental Audit Committee subcommittee looking into Britain's relationships with the Arctic. And I'm particularly delighted to welcome two ministers and our very old friend Jane Rumble, who runs the Polar Regions Department in the Foreign Office. Both ministers take an active part. Andrew Griffith, who of course is the Minister of State for Science in the Department of Science, Innovation and Technology, and David Rutley, who has responsibility, amongst other things, for the polar regions in the Foreign Office. And both David and Jane accompanied us on this David Attenborough down in our inquiry in Antarctica. And Andrew, we were sorry you couldn't be with us, but another time perhaps. Can I start off by ask you some rather easy general questions? I wouldn't want you to get complacent by how easy they are, because it's much tougher later on. But the first question really is, what Antarctica means to Britain? In other words, in a sort of way, I'm contrasting this with what the Arctic means to Britain. The Arctic means an enormous amount, and we have huge, close relations of all kinds with it. What does Antarctica mean to Britain? What's the nature of our relationship with Antarctica? Minister Rutley, perhaps.
Of course, thank you very much. Before I answer that question, thank you, it's an important question. I just wanted to thank the committee for your sincere interest in polar matters. I think the work you've done on the Arctic in particular has been really useful, and as you, Mr. Gray, know, we held the first Arctic Ministers meeting where both of us were in attendance to talk about key priorities for the Arctic. And I think the work the committee did was a prompt to put increased focus on there. It's always been important, so I think it's important to give credit where it's due. And I'd like to say thank you for the work that you've done there, and also the very constructive challenge that you're providing here, and your energy and enthusiasm as a whole group for the subject. It means a huge amount, and I think it's important for the team as well, in our Polar Regions team, when they can see that enthusiasm as well. Moves things on. As far as the UK goes and its relationship, it's sincerely meant. I don't say that so often in front of a select committee, because often it's challenge. But here I think it has been absolutely legitimate challenge, a constructive challenge too. I think it's been a great example.
Before you answer the question then, can I just slightly add to that, which is that the view that the committee has taken of this inquiry as a whole, and indeed the inquiry into the Arctic, is that we're not, perhaps like some other parliamentary select committees, keen to find things that are wrong with what you're doing. On the contrary, I think we're keen to try and support both departments in what you do in the Antarctic and find ways in which it can be improved. So I think we start from a positive and friendly standpoint rather than from an antagonistic one.
No, understood, but we also recognise that there are challenging questions, and you will provide challenge as well. So we look forward to the rest of the questions today. We've got a long and proud history of discovery, exploration and scientific research in Antarctica. We were among the first to discover and map the continent, and made the first territorial claim in 1908. We're also one of the original negotiators and the first to ratify the Antarctic Treaty, which has been in force for 63 years now. We played leading roles in negotiating subsequent treaty instruments, including the Convention for the Conservation of Antarctic Marine Living Resources. If you don't mind me calling it CAMLAR going forward, that would be good, and also the Protocol on the Environmental Protection. So we've maintained a permanent presence on the continent since World War II, and today the British Antarctic Survey is recognised as one of the world's most eminent Antarctic research institutes. I think those of us who were fortunate enough to attend the visit could see that. And BAS, together with our other research institutes and universities in the UK, work collaboratively with a range of other Antarctic treaty parties, particularly better understand the implications of climate change on the continent, and also to what that means to the planet more widely. But as the next questions may follow, our relationship and the way we look at Antarctica is different from the Arctic because of different factors. You may want to explore that, Chair. But hopefully I've set out the fundamentals of our relationship with Antarctica.
Well, yes, sort of. That was a very useful introduction and certainly was very helpful. However, it wasn't actually what I asked at all. What I was asking about was the nature of our relationship with Antarctica. Why do we have a relationship with Antarctica? What's the purpose in us being there? Is it for geopolitical reasons? Is it for scientific reasons? Is it for fishing in the Southern Ocean? I mean, what is our interest in Antarctica?
It's multifaceted, but I think the key thing is, as I've explained, is that because of our relationship, which is quite unique, there is a sovereignty claim which is, in abeyance as part of the Antarctic Treaty. But our interests are primarily around science, and clearly in the geopolitically challenging world we live in at the moment, we also have a strong view on its geopolitical significance, as well as the impact it has from a climate perspective as well.
All right, we're going to want to investigate that particular relationship more closely, I think, in a minute. I think there's quite a lot to be drilled down into precisely which bit's geopolitical and which bit's scientific. But science, which is outstanding and well-leading, is a net cost to the UK. Most things that we do in the Arctic are a net benefit, whether it be industry, whether it be fishing, whether it be tourism, whether it be all sorts of things. That's a benefit to the UK. British businesses take part in that. Science costs HMG money. What benefit does it accrue to, we'll be coming back to talk about more about science in a minute, but what benefit in general does it accrue to UK PLC?
Well, we've got the minister responsible for that sitting next to me, so he'll be able to shed more light on that as we get to these questions. But I think the key thing is science in and of itself is hugely valuable, particularly as we face into the climate challenges we're experiencing right now. We know that the Antarctic is not just interesting in and of itself, but the global implications. And obviously the science also provides that sense of presence, which is so important for our wider view of the Antarctic as well.
All right. I'm still feeling a bit kind of not quite satisfied by this, if you don't mind my saying so, Minister. I mean, it's a very, very large amount of money being spent by the British government on our relations with Antarctica. An enormous amount of money, far, far, far more than we spend, for example, in the Arctic, or indeed in many other regions of the world. We spend an enormous amount of money doing it. And what I'm trying to find out, trying to get down to, is what benefit we get from it. Now, science, great, but the science could be done elsewhere, no doubt, presumably, or much of it could be done, or could be done on a smaller scale, or could be done other ways. So leave the science on one side for a moment. Geopolitics, therefore, is all you're left with, in which case I just find the dual role between, which Bass fulfills, between science and geopolitics, really quite complex, and the funding for it. I mean, in what way do Bass decide which bit they're doing? Is our purpose in being there and spending all this money, billions of pounds altogether, is our purpose in being there in order for geopolitical reasons? Is it to say we are here, we haven't given up our claim, whatever's happening down here, we take an interest in it, and if you get this wrong, we, Britain, will be involved? I mean, that's really why we're there, isn't it?
No, I think, as I said, there are several reasons. Obviously, presence is key in terms of the issue around sovereignty, but science is fundamental too, and it's not as if we are a peripheral player in science. The science that we're doing is world leading. That's absolutely clear. And then the point that you made, and I know you've looked at this very clearly, so I say this gently because of the amount of analysis that you've done. But when you look at the amount of funding that's been attributed annually to the Antarctic and to the Arctic from a science perspective, they're very similar. Very similar. I mean, it depends from year to year. Yeah,
we'll come back to that. I mean, that's if you don't include the infrastructure. If you don't include Rothera and David Attenborough, you're quite right in saying the actual amount of money spent on science is very similar. But if you include the infrastructure costs, it's vastly different. But
just to come back on that particular point, it is also important to think about the lifetime of those investments. Both in terms of the infrastructure and also in the SDA. These again are not being used just for 1 year. This is to help future-proof. Well, I'm sure we'll speak more about this. Not only our presence, but the science there for decades to come. Hopefully 30, 40, 50 years. And so in the scheme of things, when you amortise those investments on an annual basis, the numbers are much smaller.
Well, I want leaving that case geopolitics to one side, your argument is that we gain an enormous amount out of having scientific research under BAS in Antarctica, and we ourselves saw large amounts of it, or some of it anyhow. So let me ask the Science Minister, what is done in Antarctica that couldn't be done elsewhere?
Well, first of all, thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I echo my note and thanks, I guess, to the committee for the strong interest in polar regions in particular. That is something that I have overweighted the allocation of my own time to in this role. I visited the Arctic. I was not blessed enough to I think suspect be enrolled or be available for a visit to the Antarctic.
Yet.
And it's it looks very clearly a very important scientific domain. So for my part, I make no apologies for the amount we invest. We're able to do so because of the government's unparalleled commitment to science and technology. That total budget this year will reach £20 billion a year. And so that's the sort of the numerator that we should look at, the allocation that we spend through the funding councils to what we do in Antarctica. I would, maybe this is not the right thing, but I would tend to look at it closely coupled with what we do in the Arctic as well. I mean, for example, we are sending the Sir David Attenborough up north this summer, so it's a sort of dual use, if you like, and clearly a lot of the climate-related, which is the predominant focus of our research, speaks to climate changes at both ends of the planet. So within the broad scheme of the domains in which we spend money on scientific discovery and research, this is not such a large commitment. It's been relatively static over time.
Leaving aside infrastructure then, how much do we spend on science in Antarctica?
95
we send in aggregate 95 million, and that's a combination of what you'd call the sort of infrastructure side of things, and an element of competitive funding, whereby people bid annually or triennially for their particular area of doctoral research. So if you aggregate those things,
leaving the infrastructure side, delete the infrastructure stuff, which after all you could argue is general expenditure and could be applied to the Arctic as well. The cost of David Attenborough, for example, isn't. So let's leave aside the infrastructure. How much do we actually spend on science itself in Antarctica?
It'll be about £35 million a year.
How much do we spend in the Arctic?
I don't think I've got those numbers. They're probably in your brilliant report, but I can write to the committee and let you have those.
Significantly less, I think. Clark's,
it's significant. It's significantly less because of the nature of that.
So given all right, so we spend 35 million in the Antarctic, rather less than that in the Arctic. What kind of science do we do in Antarctica that we couldn't do elsewhere, either in university laboratories or in the Arctic or elsewhere? What's so special about Antarctica? What do we do down there that we couldn't do elsewhere?
I think it's a combination of the facilities that we've got. It's a different polar environment to what goes on in the Arctic. We can fill certain gaps that wouldn't otherwise be done. There's relatively more territories engaged in Arctic research, clearly millions more people that live in the Arctic than Antarctic. So I wouldn't say there are particularly unique things. There may be if you're looking at emperor penguin colonies. You can do that at one end of the poles and not the other. But overall, you can do good polar science, and we're aided and abetted by the facilities and the establishments that we've got there.
But I'm drilling down into what the relationship the UK has with Antarctica. And we heard a moment ago that it was partly geopolitical. We'll come back to that in a second. But leaving that to one side, the other bit is science. And therefore, what I'm trying to discover is why is it that the UK is spending a large amount of money doing science? What I want to know is what we can do in Antarctica that we can't do somewhere else. I mean, is this money well spent? Why are we spending £35 million on science in Antarctica? Is a good scientific reason? Emperor penguins you mentioned, so I guess the biodiversity side of things a little bit. But BBC livestock people could do that for us. I mean, I joke. But what are we doing in Antarctica that we couldn't do elsewhere?
Well, I think the thing to highlight is we have got critical mass. We are well established in Antarctica, and we're well cited on the vast amount of research that we produce from Antarctica, which is much valued, not just by the UK but across the world. So, first of all, we've got form. We are well respected, and that science has helped inform huge amounts of views on what's happening in climate change, and we're doing great research in the Arctic as well. I think at the heart of part of your question is partly about which is a priority, and partly because of the education you've helped immerse me in. I would say they're both important. And having recently attended the Arctic Encounters Conference in Alaska and seen the geopolitical challenges that are before us in the Arctic, clearly there are a huge amount of issues that we need to confront and face into with our like-minded allies there. There are other reasons why we want to be interested in what's going on in the Antarctic. Science unites us on both sides, but geopolitically there are different circumstances around the South Pole, which we also need to show a real interest in.
So before we move on to that, I'm still finding myself a little confused here. Your argument was there are two reasons for being in Antarctica. Two things are central to Britain's relationship with Antarctica. One is geopolitics, and we'll come back to that in a moment, and I think that's a very important point to make, and that's a matter of the Foreign Office. The other was science. And we've managed to establish that we're spending £35 million a year on science. So what I'm trying to find out is why are we spending that £35 million? What is so special about science in Antarctica that we haven't got elsewhere? Why are we doing it? Is it just an excuse? Is the science we're doing in Antarctica just a cover for our geopolitical person being there? Or is it, as I think you were hinting at a moment ago, we're there because we're there because we're there, and you're probably quite right in saying withdrawing now would cost more than staying on, as it were. But that's a separate matter. That's a different. But I mean, I'm still a little puzzled about, or not puzzled actually, because I think I know the answer. But I'm keen to know what you think we're gaining scientifically from our presence in Antarctica.
Well, as we saw from some of the work that we were able to see firsthand in the Antarctic, there's unique work going on biodiversity, that's clear. That's both in terms of marine and other wildlife. And then in terms of what's going on in terms of space weather and some of the other work that we saw in terms of the ocean circulation as well, we wouldn't be able to, we could rely on third-party research if we wanted to. But I think given the history and given the role that we play, you used the word beginning with W, withdrawal. I mean, that's not on the agenda, just to be very clear with the committee. We've been there for the long haul. We intend to be there for the long haul. It's not just a matter of history, but given that we are there, we have a sovereignty claim, which of course we want to uphold. But the science in and of itself is absolutely invaluable, and we're very good at it.
Okay, well, let's move on to that. Given that, as far as we can make out, the science is brilliant, but that's less important than the geopolitical reason for being there. Given that's the case, why is the Foreign Office responsibility and the MOD responsibility funded by this rather curious route through BAS? Well, why is DCIT, or what is it now called? Well, why is UCRI and DCIT funding it to BAS rather than the Foreign Office? Elsewhere in the world, if we have a need for a geopolitical presence in Hong Kong or in where it might be, the Foreign Office pays for it. Why is it uniquely in Antarctica is our presence there, our geopolitical presence there, funded through this scientific route?
Well, partly, and I'll let obviously the Science Minister come in, but all I would just say on this is it's of course the science is key for our presence, but as I've said several times, the science in and of itself is vitally important as well. And what we want is to make sure that that science and the science that is taken forward is the best possible science, and that's where it's best left to DZIT and the relevant research bodies to determine what research should be taken forward. So we have a clear view that there needs to be a presence there. We have a clear view that important science should take place, but at that point we then hand over to the experts who make the decisions about what type of science.
Of course, I think you're misunderstanding me. Of course, I accept that entirely. We're leaving science to one side for a moment. What we're talking about now is the need for Britain to have a geopolitical presence in the south, in Antarctica, and I entirely accept that. I'm not asking the question why. Let's assume you do. My question is why, given Britain's necessity to have a presence in Antarctica, is that funded through DCIT, UCRI, BAS, through the scientific wing, rather than through the political wing, namely the Foreign Office?
Yeah, and sorry, I'll try that answer again, but what I'm trying to underpin is that our approach is science-led and our presence is science-led. So other countries have got a presence there and have limited science capability, often carried out by military personnel. We have a very different approach, and as you've seen on your visit, we do have some military support there, but the primary presence, the primary focus is around the science, and that's why the funding is linked to the science, and the decisions about what science goes on there isn't a call by FCDO, it's a call by DZ.
Right, forgive me,
and those who work on it.
Perhaps not being clear enough. Let me try and be very, very clear indeed in my questions. I think perhaps I'm mumbling. I tend to mumble a bit. I do apologise for that. Britain spends a very large amount of money with our presence in Antarctica. That's my first question to you. And you made it plain that was partly because we provide world-class science, and I'm convinced that we do. I wouldn't knock that for a second. I'm certain we do provide world-class science. But that also the purpose in being there was for the geopolitical reason of having a presence in Antarctica for all the historic reasons that you described. My question was, given that's the case, well, I suppose first of all, which is more important? And if you were to say science is more important, we come back to the question of why can't you do that somewhere else? And also why are we spending such a gigantic amount of money doing it? But secondly, if, as I suspect, that's a perfectly legitimate and reasonable thing to say, the reason for our being there is because of geopolitics, for our presence in Antarctica, our presence in the Southern Ocean. If that's our reason for being there, why is it funded in this particular way? What's the basis, what's the origin of the funding stream? I think you'll agree it's an important question because, apart from anything else, the quantity of funding then becomes not a matter for the Foreign Secretary, but a matter for the Science Secretary. Quite a different matter. So why is the funding for our geopolitical presence in Antarctica done through DCIT, UCRI, BAS?
Okay, I'll try it one more time, and you certainly weren't mumbling. But I'm just trying to explain it from our perspective, and if I'm not doing it clear enough, I apologise. But the key thing is BAS has got a dual role. It provides world-class science and an active influential presence in Antarctica. And the funding, as I said, follows the science because that is the primary activity that takes place. One thing that we haven't talked about so far, and I think will maybe help, but not completely answer your questions to satisfaction, because we're quite happy with the approach that's being taken here. And the other thing I would say is that while you make the point that this is expensive, yes, this is an investment in science, but relative to the size of the total science budget, it's relatively small. What's the total, and in terms of being able to...
What's the total cost of our presence in Antarctica every year?
Well, the question you raised, Chair, was the cost of the science,
yes,
which is 35 million,
yeah.
And the presence on top, I think, is around another 60. So that's 95 million for presence alone, and then science on top. So that is a lot of money, but in the scheme of...
Capital spend?
That's annual.
That's revenue spend, isn't it?
That's revenue spend, and then capital on
Capital
top,
spend in the last couple of years has been...
Well, the SDA is about 250 million, and then you've got about 90, I think, million for the Discovery Centre. But we can give you the breakdown. But again, those investments are not for the next 2 or 3 years, expecting a payback in 3 years. This is because, as we saw on the trip, a lot of that infrastructure is very old. That to me feels recent, 1980s. I remember them very well. But that's a long time ago in terms of infrastructure. And they do need to be refreshed. There's no question of it. So the premise of your question, I understand. I would just disagree to some extent about the relative cost of being able to maintain presence and to have this excellent science available. And BAS, just to give some reassurance to the committee, it isn't just a decision that is made completely by the DZIT. There is a review group which includes FCDO, the MOD, and the Cabinet Office as well, that meets twice a year. So there are key decisions around the science, but we recognise the dual mission, and as a result, there is a coordinating body that reviews and works together, and involves the National Security Council when required as well.
Okay, let me one final bash of this before I don't mean to bore everyone rigid with it, but nonetheless, it's a quite important matter. If you put together the capital investment and the revenue investment the last couple of years, we're talking about £1 billion or thereabouts, roughly, give or take. So the UK has spent £1 billion, give or take, on our presence in Antarctica, from which we've got £37 million of science, a very small amount, I'm told, by comparison to the rest of the scientific budget. But surely that's disproportionate. Surely we've spent an enormous amount of money for a very small return.
No, I'll just have one final go at this, and I know Andrew's probably itching to get in, but as we saw, the infrastructure that's being built, and we'll no doubt have more conversations about this, is of a very high standard. It needs to be, because of the weather and the climate and the challenges there, but they're built to last, and they're built there for another 50 years or so. So I think what needs to happen is to look at the infrastructure, the capital expenditure over the lifetime of those projects. That changes the arithmetic and the financial calculations quite significantly. Yes, there has been investment, but we need to, for presence, we need to, because the science is critical. Never has been any more important because of what's happening in the climate and the lessons that we're learning, particularly from the science we're doing in the Arctic, but also in the Antarctic. Do you want to come in on that at all?
Well, just to quickly, I mean, obviously it's not for us to ask the questions, but if we did have a perfect delineation or an allocation in finance director terms, I mean, would that help us? I mean, we're lucky that we have a strong institution, science-led, in the British Antarctic Survey. So if we did actually have, government accounting lines with different numbers for different departments, would it actually help us, or we would just argue endlessly about the allocations of those anyway? Look, there's a cost to doing science at a distance. I mean, the same logic would say, look, if you send an experiment up on a rocket, 90% of the cost is actually getting that experiment into orbit. The actual experiment itself is probably relatively modest, but you've got to protect it from a very harsh environment, you've got to project it at a distance, you've got to be able to recover the data afterwards. And I accept that's not a perfect analogy, Mr. Chairman, but there will be somewhat of that we're operating in a harsh and hostile environment at great distance. We want to play our part as a global scientific superpower. I suspect most members of the committee would rather we did more climate science rather than less as a public policy choice. And I think, given the institutional settlement we've got, given that it is collaborative both across government, but it's also collaborative internationally, virtually everything we do is some form of international collaboration, I don't think we should be uncontent with the situation that we find ourselves in.
Okay, let me move on very slightly, if I may. It was nice to have one recommendation from an Arctic report to be actually acted on, namely the ministerial meeting which happened, I think, last week. And thank you for that, and thank you for the credits too. It's nice to. When my grandchildren ask me what I did, I'll say I got the ministers to meet once a month, or what it was. What happens with regard to Antarctica? Do the various, you mentioned, I think officials presumably meet regularly to discuss the funding aspect of things. Do all of the ministers with responsibility for Antarctica meet on a regular basis?
Not in quite the same way, partly because the relationship's different. There are real differences between the Arctic and the Antarctic, and there's also a difference in our relationship with those chunks of geography. In the Arctic, we're a near neighbour, but in the Antarctic, we have sovereignty claim, and so we have an important line here where the FCDO takes a lead in that area, and that includes representing the UK at the Antarctic Treaty consultative meetings, and also in administering the UK domestic legislation as well, and our excellent Polar Region Department, led by Jane Rumble here, is also part of the Overseas Territories and Polar Directive, but they administer the British Antarctic Territory. So there is a clear lead in this area, but that said, we work regularly with other government departments, DZIT, MOD, as I talked about, and the Cabinet Office as well, and also DFT from a shipping perspective, and DEFRA from a fishing perspective as well.
There would be nothing ab initio to stop us doing that if the committee needed something else for your grandchildren.
One second, but let me ask one little logical thing. Foreign Office is in the lead in all these matters for very good reason you describe. But a moment ago you went to great lengths to say that science was in the lead.
But as I said, this is regarding the sovereignty aspect.
Yes.
And so there's a clear lead here. You talked about the geography, okay, in terms of the presence and the activity that's involved in that geographic area. It's predominantly science, and therefore we have the approach that we have.
How often do you all meet? MOD, presumably they're responsible protector, DCIT, Foreign Office. I mean, how often do your ministers meet to discuss Antarctic matters?
The approach that's taken here is different from where we are now with the Arctic, because this is more a business as usual arrangement where, because of the different treaty meetings and so forth that take place and CAMNAR meetings, there's more of a regular rhythm. And as I said, the departments work very closely, with Jane taking a lead role from an administrative perspective.
How perhaps Jane will know, because it happens at official level, to be clear, but the BAS review group, which is chaired by DCIT, following the science, but is de facto, is probably de jure, the formal group that meets. How often does that meet, Jane?
That meets twice a year.
Right. That's the BAS review group.
At official level, though, Jane, ministers don't meet. I mean, you're both one responsible for science, one responsible for Foreign Office. Leaving aside preparations for this hearing, which I'm sure you've got together and chewed it over a bit, how often would you meet on an official way in the department for discussions about Antarctic matters?
Well, you've only been in role a few months. We haven't had a formal meeting, and often, as is the case, we rely on officials to take this work forward. But I think if the committee were to recommend that there could be more coordination, we would certainly consider that. But all I would just say, because this isn't just about the chair's grandchildren, but we do have a different rhythm of activity in the Antarctic. That's the thing.
I realise that, but hang on, we've been talking about the relationship between the science aspects of things and the geopolitical aspects of things, and therefore I'd have thought it would be perfectly reasonable that ministers with responsibility for those two things would meet to discuss them. But now you're telling me they don't. And that seems to me to be odd. I mean, how do you decide?
It's slightly different in the sense that...
But we've now got meetings mandated on Arctic matters, so we could extend that to polar matters. And
we're happy to do it. I just want to reassure that...
2 for 1.
Yes,
that's quite a good idea. Yes.
I'm very happy with that. But I just want to reassure the committee that, as required, ministers do have these conversations. There's just a different rhythm as far as the Antarctic goes.
Okay. Climate change.
Thank you. Climate change, exactly. Well, you've both touched on climate change impact on Antarctica. It wasn't originally a part of the treaty system, but it's clearly becoming the focus of most of the scientific research. Can you, sort of at a top level, explain what are the consequences of climate change on Antarctica as the UK sees it from perhaps from the Foreign Office perspective and then from science perspective?
There are a number of key issues which we were able to talk about and witness when we were there. The Antarctica is warming around twice the global average, and so from an atmospheric and oceanographic warming together causing increasing ice melt. That's clear. You can see that, and that's increasingly contributing to global sea level rises. And not only that, the thing I learned through the visit as well is that with the meltwater from the Antarctic, it's also affecting the circulation of global ocean currents. It's pretty clear. You can see that. I know that Matthew's got better understanding of this given his love of the sea. So it is globally significant what's happening there. It's not just about what's happening in the Antarctic or the biodiversity there. These have compelling impacts around the world. And it was quite interesting on Sir David Attenborough we had a couple of Dutch scientists that were with us, and I was trying to work out. I didn't realise the Dutch were that interested in Antarctic research, and so I gently just asked, "Why are you so interested in Antarctic research?" And they said, "Well, when 25% of your country's under the sea level, you get very interested in Antarctic studies very quickly." One of the most compelling answers I've had to why it's important to study the Antarctic.
Thank you. And from a scientific point of view, can you elaborate on that?
Less on the. I think David talked about the significance of that, which is well understood for climate, for nature, biodiversity. A lot of food chains ultimately start in the polar regions. But I'm not your scientist, and you've taken evidence, I think, from Jane and others. In terms of what we do, we are at the heart of most of the big international collaborations, taking measurements, observations, understanding the changes and the rate of change in the Arctic. For example, the International Thwaites Glacier collaboration, which is between NERC and the US National Science Foundation, but also projects on behalf of the European Space Agency and climate observations on behalf of bodies like the IPCC and the World Meteorological Organization. So there's a lot that we do that we're actually contributing to in terms of taking measurements, and there is more that we can do going forward as part of a project called In Sync, which is all of those who are doing Antarctic science collaborating to take simultaneous measurements across the whole of the region, which would only be possible if one worked collaboratively to do that.
Is that work focused? David mentions water, ocean levels rising, but the impact on the continent itself of Antarctica can best be done through international collaboration, as you just said. Is the focus primarily on understanding the impact on Antarctica of global warming, or on what's happening to the rest of the planet as a result of global warming's impact on Antarctica?
I think it's both. I think it's all
Jane may want to come in
joined
here.
up. Go on, Jane.
Do you want to talk on this?
Go on.
Yeah, so the science objectives really are twofold. One is to understand how Antarctica is driving global atmosphere and global ocean change so that we can understand the rest of the globe, which will improve our climate modelling, understand sea level impacts that we're going to have, what's happening to our weather. Also, the Antarctic Treaty System is responsible for the management of Antarctica itself. So for that, we need to understand what are the local and regional implications so that we can better manage human activity, tourism, fishing, what's happening to the biodiversity, how can we best protect vulnerable species. So it's very much both. One is arguably bigger, because understanding the whole globe is a much more kind of complex focus. The other one is, well, I suppose you'd say it was equally complex, but it's a smaller scale. So.
The treaty system was established before climate change was a thing and not included in the treaty. Is there work being done to consider whether we need to adapt the treaty in order to take into account climate change, which is now the most important thing that we're looking at there?
Yeah, it's a good question. And obviously there has been a lot of work that's been done, particularly between the UK and Norway initially. They chaired the Antarctic Treaty meeting on experts on climate change back in 2010. And then climate change became a standing agenda item, both for the Antarctic Treaty consultative meetings, which are annual, and also the CAMLAR meetings, which are also annual. So that was a key moment to make sure that we had that as a standing agenda item. And that's been going for around 13, 14 years now.
Another thing that's happened recently, obviously, is the biodiversity impact of climate change. And I wasn't, unfortunately, on the visit, but I think those that were interested in particular in the global impact of avian influenza on many species that are indigenous. How is, is that a standing item on the agenda, biodiversity impact?
Let me just come on to the point about avian flu, but is biodiversity also a standing item? I know climate change is, but I just want to make sure.
Yes, the Antarctic Treaty, the Environmental Protocol to the Antarctic Treaty kind of gives the framework for comprehensive environmental protection, including biodiversity, and the Committee for Environmental Protection is established to advise the Antarctic Treaty Consultative Meeting on the implementation of the protocol, which covers biodiversity. So it's not an agenda item of its own, but the committee's main role is to advise on that.
I mean, one of the things that we're trying to do is to come up with recommendations to help the government formulate policy where there may be gaps. Is this an area where there might be something that we could recommend to you as ministers, whether it would be helpful to you? So, I mean, it's now in the public consciousness very recently that emperor penguins colonies are under enormous threat, and perhaps that wasn't widely known until we've had the benefit of the real Sir David Attenborough's work and all the Blue Planet programs and Frozen Planet programs showing that to the general public. I think there's much more interest because of the global biodiversity crisis, and as you say, many of the food chain elements start in Arctic regions or Antarctic regions. Can you perhaps, maybe this is unfair to ask Jane, but maybe the ministers might like to encourage a nudge in this direction.
Yeah, I think as Jane said, and as we were saying particularly around climate, these are now agenda items on these bodies. I think encouragement for all parties to make this a key priority would be hugely helpful, particularly as it's on a cross-party basis. And as we'll come on to, there are other areas where a nudge from the committee would be very helpful to see more collaboration around fisheries management and marine conservation, but we'll come to that, no doubt, in due course. Yeah. And on avian flu, we're obviously keeping very close to the situation there, monitoring it very closely, and as those who attended the trip know, there's very, very keen interest in making sure that steps taken to stop the further spread through human activity, but we're monitoring and tracking what's going on amongst other species as well.
Thank you.
Well, it affected walrus in the north, I think, hasn't it?
Yeah.
Reported this week, I think. Did I see walrus going down, dying through avian flu? Anna.
Thank you. So just moving on from the previous questions, how do you feel, and I address this to Minister Rutley, how do you feel that global politics and the changes in geopolitics impact the effectiveness of the Antarctic Treaty System? And how do they maintain Antarctica as that continent for peace and also for scientific research?
Yeah, we had some quite lively conversations about this on the visit. And I think, first of all, to reassure people, and the Antarctic Treaty, I think, has been a tremendous vehicle for peace in a continent that's never experienced any military activity or any military conflict, at least. And long may that continue. We want to make sure that the purpose of the treaty is being about conflict prevention continues. And when you add the treaty system together, those three different elements, the treaty, CAMLAR and the environmental protocol, that provides a really solid foundation. And I think there's been good evidence overall that the parties and the Antarctic operators there comply with those treaties. That said, and this is the heart of your question, with the geopolitical challenges we're now seeing and the headwinds we're facing into, it's more challenging. That's why, in the answer to Philip's question about where can this committee point, the committee is very well informed and will form its own view. But I think we could all see that there is a requirement here for people to try and, for different countries to put aside their own national interest to some degree and focus on what's important for the planet, which is critical here. And I think just two areas where I'm particularly worried and be interested in your views as well, Anna. I think some of the activities by Russia in making it really difficult to agree catch limits in CAMLAR, for example, and China being quite slow to the table on issues around marine conservation are worries, particularly with Russia, where it feels to some extent politically motivated. And that's the worry, if we start seeing geopolitics influencing what has been a very successful treaty.
Yeah. And I'll come on to Russia, but I think we've heard evidence here to this committee from Professor Dodds, who said that Antarctic policy, particularly on the environment, is arguably at its most challenging since the late 80s. So it's what is the UK government doing to support and prevent that consensus within the treaty breaking down, particularly concerning issues, as just mentioned by Philip, on the protection of species like the emperor penguins?
Well, we continue to work with all relevant parties. We've got the next meeting that's taking place in India later this month.
Yes, 2 weeks.
2 weeks' time. So that's a key moment where we can help to reinforce, the key purposes of the treaty and encourage all parties to live up to those ambitions and aspirations.
So that's the treaty consultative meeting.
Correct.
In India, yeah?
Yes.
So is the UK government particularly going to set out its stall on what is happening about in terms of what Russia is doing and the potential actions of Russia and how that might impact on Antarctica and the treaty?
We do that in those and around those key convening moments in Kamla as well. But, there are other bilateral moments as well where we can communicate these issues with our friends and allies around the world and indeed with those who don't share our values too. So I think there's different levels here where we can work in multilateral fora but also bilaterally as well.
We've heard actually that one of the ships, that the scientific vessels that Russia was using, has actually been sanctioned by the US because of the invasion of Ukraine, but also potentially because of some of the activities that it was partaking in Antarctica. The committee was informed about some troubling current Russian activity and collection of seismic data. So that sounds more like prospecting minerals rather than collation of scientific data and research. So are you aware of this, and what is the UK government's response to it?
Yeah, in terms of, again, the treaty is very clear that, or at least the protocol around, related to it on environmental protection is very clear. It prohibits the exploitation of mineral resources in the Antarctic, except for smaller scientific purposes. And that's indefinite in scope. That goes on and on. Russia's had a long-standing program of surveying and mapping the geology of Antarctica, both on the land and on the seabed, and they have repeatedly given assurances that at the Antarctic Treaty Consultative Meeting that these activities are for scientific purposes, and they've also joined the consensus on a new resolution adopted last year on reaffirming ongoing commitment to the prohibition of Antarctic mineral resource activities other than for scientific research. But we will continue to monitor that situation.
You're content to believe Russia when they say they're just undertaking scientific data?
We continue to monitor the situation, and we continue to make our points clearly heard, as do other members of the treaty as well.
What are the ramifications then, if actually, as what some of our people, including Professor Klaus, has given in evidence, is concerned about, that actually this is for a different matter and it's not for scientific purposes?
Well, the treaty is very clear. The treaty is very clear. Russia has recently reaffirmed its commitment to the key elements of the treaty that you're talking about, and they need to be held to account on this, as we all do. I mean, these are a treaty that we've all signed up to. It's been hugely successful, one of the most successful treaties in our recent history, and all parties will want it to continue. So we have to hold people to account.
Okay, thank you on that. So just moving on.
Can I just wind down, if I'm allowed to interrupt very briefly on this? I recognise that that's the case, of course. But the journalist who has written to us to allege all sorts of nefarious practices by Russian ships has made some very, very specific allegations indeed that Russia are fundamentally breaching the treaty conditions. they are using those scientific vessels for mineral research and potentially for military purposes. I mean, have you seen those allegations? It's a slightly obscure South African journalist. I'm not saying it's true necessarily, but nonetheless, have you seen those allegations, and if so, what do you make of them?
I personally haven't seen them myself. I've heard of them, so all I can say is what I've said so far. But clearly, I'll take a closer look, given the interest of the committee.
I think what we'll do, if that's all right by you, we'll pass you a letter we've had from these journalists. I have no idea who they are, but it's worth passing to you, and perhaps the Foreign Office will want to look into it, because they are extremely serious allegations about Russian malpractice.
Yeah, it does come back to Anna's point. Fundamentally, we've had a very successful treaty here, and geopolitical headwinds are challenging, but we need to stick the course on this, and all parties do.
Yeah. Thank you. And we'd be grateful if you could then raise it at this treaty meeting if you feel that's necessary after seeing some of the allegations.
You're going to the meeting, aren't you?
Yes, we have had the same information that you've had.
Okay.
There isn't any evidence that would point to a breach of the treaty. You would need different equipment between surveying and actual exploitation. So there isn't a shift to it, but yes, we're watching it very closely. And Russia have been tackled on this before, and in fact have assured the ATCM on multiple occasions that this is a science programme. So we'll keep it under review.
I just wanted to ask, so on our visit to Antarctica, we went through the Falklands. The Falklands are very keen to create a gateway to Antarctic port and also be seen as the gateway to Antarctica. What plans does the UK government have to ensure that this happens? We also went into Punta Arenas, so we saw the plans from Chile. We know that the Sir David Attenborough goes in and uses their port and resources because the flights there are much easier. So what plans do you have?
Yeah, well, the plans that we have, obviously linking with the Falkland Islands government, they're going to be looking to enhance their gateway capability. Sir David Attenborough and the Bass's 5 aircraft are all registered in the Falkland Islands, and they routinely operate from there. And with the Falkland Islands government, they're going to be investing more in a new port, upgrading facilities at Stanley to better meet future needs. And my understanding is that those aims will mean that the replacement infrastructure is in place in about 2027. But I think it's also very clear from our visit and the journey to start the visit, that, if I can put it politely, is that there are challenges, which I know very clearly as the Overseas Territories Minister, and all of you know, about how to get to the Falklands. And so, obviously, the air bridge needs to be made as reliable as possible, not least of which for the people that live there, but also the defence purposes that are required on the Falklands. But we're also doing all that we can, working with the new Argentinian government to get to a better place in that relationship, to reset that relationship, and that might provide some opportunities in future. But all these steps with the Falklands, we have to work very closely with the MLAs, who you spent time with, and their considerations, and the people of the Falklands are very important in this whole dynamic as well.
Thank you. And just finally, there is increasing strategic competition in the polar regions and in Antarctica. But also with that then concerns about weaponisation of science. So, for example, we've heard on whether this is weaponisation or not, and you can comment, but we've heard that China established a station to support a national satellite ocean application service, for example, and there's a lot of competition such as this. So how does the government evaluate the role of infrastructure development in terms of geopolitics and what is going on with other countries? And particularly looking at Rothera, and we saw the infrastructure development there and the investment that the government is making and BAS is making there as a tool for enhancing the UK's role in soft power and using science as a soft power.
Yeah, well, we continue to monitor the situation there, obviously. There are positive examples of how infrastructure developments, not only our own, but other countries, have helped massively in taking forward science and producing really invaluable science output. But there have also been examples of stations where they've been constructed and maintained for pretty negligible science output. And what we would advocate very strongly with every influence that we can is that infrastructure in such an important part of the world, one which we want to keep as pristine as possible, should be and primarily support meaningful science outputs.
Can I just turn to the Science Minister then on that? So what is your view in terms of how science can help with our geopolitics, not the infrastructure and the soft powers we have, but how can we as a nation and working within the treaty ensure that it's not being used for false purposes elsewhere?
The latter I know less about in terms of how one enforces and polices. I think that's slightly different equities. But in terms of what we do for soft power, our science is essentially collaborative and essentially open. Best example of that is our readmission into Horizon, the world's largest collaborative international science programme. But we also have our own significant bilateral science programmes, some of which qualify as ODA as well, depending on the country in which we operate. And our commitment to open science, to publish the research of that, which is a key protection against people using that for nefarious purposes, is absolute. And the UK leads the way on that.
Can I just check, just finally with Jane? Jane, can I just be I'm correct in thinking that all Antarctic science is open within the treaty? So everything conducted scientifically has to be, the data has to be open and available?
Yeah, the treaty has a provision for open science. What that means is up to interpretation about how quickly it becomes open, but yeah, certainly all the UK data will eventually become
all ours
open,
is all publicly funded
but
science.
It's under the treaty law, under the treaty agreement,
yes,
that it has to be anyway. So that's not a UK thing.
No, it's a more general thing. So all UKRI publicly funded science has to be open. Yeah. So if you want, there's a belt and braces, but we would do that regardless of the treaty.
How many scientific research bases does China have on the continent? Five. And I think I'm right in saying that under the treaty system, all of the bases can be visited by other nations and inspected.
Correct.
Do the Chinese allow us into their bases to inspect them?
Yes.
Okay. Do they have people there? Are they manned? They do. Staff? Because they didn't in the Allison, did they? I think.
No,
maybe you don't know about that. But.
The Antarctic bases, some are summer only, so they're not staffed in the summer. We have summer only bases as well, so they are staffed in the summer, not in the winter. Summer year round. But yes, the 5 stations that they currently have are all operational.
Okay.
And they're ready to welcome in inspectors. They welcome in inspectors.
But they meet the obligations of the treaty to be inspected.
What are the Russians? How many bases the Russians got?
That's a good question. It's kind of 6 or 7 at least. Some of them are not operational, so they arguably are in disrepair. They definitely operate at least 2, possibly 3.
You'll see the general thrust of my questioning is to what degree are we content that these are genuinely scientific research stations,
yeah,
and
exactly.
to what degree are they for military or even commercial purposes? I mean, do we have an official government view on that question?
Well, our approach, and as I said, is that we advocate that those facilities are used for science. I mean, that's
we advocate, but the question is whether they are.
And they can be inspected. That's the thing. So the science is open, and the facilities are open for inspection.
Right. So the government has no knowledge suggesting other than that the Russian and the Chinese bases are used for purely scientific purposes. That's your official line. Is you're convinced that's the case?
Jane, do you want to come in on this?
Yeah, I would say that there's periodical evaluations of the contribution of each state to Antarctic science, and it's pretty clear that the Chinese contribution of Antarctic science is exponentially increasing, so their scientific output is largely increasing. I would say Russia's is fairly low and continually steady at a fairly low level as far as we can see, although they have done some significant science in terms of drilling into Lake Vostok, although that in itself was controversial. So they've done some big projects, but the Chinese contribution is definitely increasing.
Okay, but sorry to bang on about this, but at an official level, anyhow, officially, you are convinced that the Chinese and the Russians are entirely within the terms of the treaty. They are not using these bases for military or for commercial purposes. They are using them for scientific purposes.
Mm-hmm. Haven't got any evidence to the contrary.
Yeah, we haven't seen any evidence to the contrary. So
that's a wonderful Foreign Office in front of you. No evidence to the contrary. It's okay, understood. I think for the record, the senior official, Jane Rumble, said no evidence to the contrary and giggled rather fetchingly. And so, you know.
I think that was a giggle. It was intake of breath.
Intake of breath, that's what I meant to say, yes, that's what I meant to say. So, yeah, right, okay. Matthew. Sorry, that was an interlude.
Indeed. Minister Rutley, you mentioned in the previous answer about the conservation of Antarctic marine living resources, CAMLR, as we refer to it. What, if any, specific actions are yourself or the department taking to strengthen both conservation and fisheries management, when we consider changes to the Antarctic ecosystems, particularly from climate change?
Yeah. Chair, do you mind if I will respond to that question, but I think, have we finished the geopolitical side here? And we're going into another key component now on CAMLR and fisheries. But I didn't know where to put this into the conversation, but I think I should do it here if that's okay. And I'll say it because it's important. And again, it does respond in part to the work of this committee, so I hope you'll be pleased to hear this. But FCDO periodically develops more specific strategies relating to the UK Antarctic interests, but these documents are not normally published documents. But what I can inform the committee is that I've commissioned officials to develop a strategy for public release later this year in the autumn that will define the UK's long-standing interests in the Antarctic and set out our ambitions for the region. I hope that in part answers, or at least recognises, that we need to focus more efforts on the Antarctic, but also to answer more fully some of the questions that have been asked here. I'll come on to the CAMLR, so apologies, but I just wanted to make sure we got that on, and it wasn't a tail-end question, because it might be important for on Anna's dimension on geopolitics. Yeah.
Thank you. Can I just clarify then that is a renewed Antarctic strategy?
We have something which is a British Antarctic Territory strategy relating to the territory, and this is a strategy. We have a strategy, but it's an internal document. And what we want to do now, given the significance of the issues and the real interest that's being shown, not just from this committee, but primarily from this committee, but elsewhere in Parliament too, that we will now go for a published strategy that will be set out and then can be, obviously, we can be held to account to, but also, hopefully, it will spark further interest here as well and further debate.
Is that joint with the scientific?
It will be cross-government, yeah. FCDO lead to the previous line of questioning, but it will involve other departments as well. Hopefully that will show that while we need to consider the approach to cross-government working, where FCDO takes the lead, this strategy will help set out the wider context. Any other points on that, or should we go to CAMLR?
Just say that's very welcome indeed. I think we'll probably make that one of our recommendations, even though you've already confirmed it, so that it being the autumn, whatever government may be around after the autumn will be bound by it, if you see what I mean. So we'll try and make it a recommendation.
That's a good point. Look, I think from the conversations we've had, some of them are quite challenging, it's very clear that cross-party there's an interest in this. So, and this stuff sits way above party politics, as far as I'm concerned. So whatever happens at the election, we'll be in a good place. The timing, I have to be quite general, because obviously we're also working on overseas territory strategy that will be done by the summer recess, and we only have finite resources, but Jane and the team are working very hard on this, and the quality of the work is always good.
I'm told that votes are imminent, but Matthew, please carry on. In the meantime, if there's division, we'll suspend for 15 minutes. If there's one vote, or for 20...
That's multiple votes.
Yes.
I'll give multiple.
Oh God, I believe so.
All right.
Okay. Shall I try and answer some of the questions as best I can, and then we'll. if we can't get it all on the record straight away, we can always write, but I'm sure we can achieve this. We're fully committed to CAMLAR, which has got great history of scientific exploration in the Southern Ocean, and it's always seen objective evidence as vital for underpinning decision making and management of fishery stocks. The UK is both a fishing nation and active advocate of enhanced marine protection areas in the CAMLAR area, and the objective of CAMLAR fundamentally is conservation, but it provides for fishing activities where they can be done on a sustainable basis. British fishing vessels have operated in the Ross Sea since the early 2000s, and the government of South Georgia and the South Sandwich Islands manage toothfish, icefish and krill fishing in the waters in accordance with the provisions of CAMLAR. And we also led on the first CAMLAR marine protected area that was adopted in 2009, and we're co-sponsoring 3 further proposals under consideration by CAMLAR. So I think we've got a proud record of conservation within the CAMLAR environment.
Would you say that you are seeking to enforce or strengthen that in light of the ecosystem changes as a result of climate change?
Yeah, I think when you see the work that goes on, it's not just us. There are others who want to have greater marine protection. I think we're taking a leading role. We've seen the first marine protected area, as I said, but we're co-sponsoring 3 other proposals, and I think there's another one on top. So there's 4 marine protected areas, and I think the committee is also aware that recently we expanded the area of no catch zone within the South Georgia and South Sandwich Islands area as well. So I think we've got a good record there. Notwithstanding the fact there are tensions, which you may well be coming on to next, but we'll see.
Well, you certainly foresaw that coming, didn't you? But, yes, indeed, there are tensions within CAMLAR, and that's particularly through Russia and China, who often seek to obstruct some of the conservation measures that are being proposed. So is the UK working with others to try and overcome some of these challenges that are being put in front of CAMLAR? And can you give us any examples of specific initiatives that you are seeking to cooperate with others to prevent the obstruction by those 2 countries?
Yeah, and thanks. This is an important question. The challenges we're finding in the CAMLAR area around the marine protected area discussions particularly, and Russia most particularly, and to some extent China, have been resisting moves on a number of MPA proposals. I think they're trying, what they say in their arguments is they're trying to balance the protection also with the erosion of future fishing opportunities. I think we're very aware, though, that we have to protect those stocks in a very meaningful and sustainable way, and we need to do it quickly. But since 2021, Russia has been egregiously blocking consensus, and consensus is a key thing in the context of CAMLAR on the scientifically derived catch limit for the South Georgia tooth fishery, based on very spurious arguments and not recognised by other CAMLAR members. That's clearly politically motivated, probably made worse by the situation of their illegal invasion of Ukraine, and they're directed at the UK. But it's also a disrupting tactic to CAMLAR's wider activities as well.
Are we taking any particular steps to overcome some of those tactics, as you say?
Well, we're trying to work with our partners here, and obviously it'll be interesting to see what the committee has to say here on this. I think you probably share a very similar view to government that we need support from our friends on the particular matters as well. We're being unfairly targeted.
We're also aware that there's been clashes between the UK and Russia over fishing rights in places including South Georgia. And there's also been some tensions with our allies such as the US, which is concerning. But what that demonstrates to me is the complexity of geopolitics in the area, particularly around fisheries management. But how would you address some of these challenges, ensure that we safeguard our interests in places like the South Atlantic?
Well, I think our commitment is pretty clear by our actions that we've taken to protect areas. I think we're well regarded around the world for the marine protected areas we put into place, and we're doing similar work here in the CAMLAR as well. We're working not just in multilateral fora, but also bilaterally to make our case. But as you say, I mean, these are complex situations, and they're also made probably more challenging by the fact that there are a lot of challenging issues in the world at the moment, and there's only a certain amount of bandwidth. So we have to work very hard to make sure that our voice is heard on these issues, which are about fairness, but also about the sustainability of fishery stocks in a very sensitive part of the world.
Thank you.
All right.
Thank you, Chair. Look, I want to ask you both about science in the Antarctica, but also to separately, as it were, to try and segregate talking about the science from talking about the funding for the science, if we can try and sort of compartmentalise it like that. Mr. Griffith, can you tell us what steps is the UK government taking to support research and infrastructure development in the Antarctica?
We have, first of all, we continue a clear commitment to our funding. Secondly, we have gone through a process of significant infrastructure upgrade. That's happening right now on the Rothera station. But obviously you've seen the Sir David Attenborough. You missed out too.
Yes, Philip and I are the ones that
let's hope
feel
there's
very
an
bitter
opportunity
about
to do that. But the Sir David Attenborough, which gets rave reviews, was a significant injection of capital into our facilities there. So those are really the two things, Mr. Gardner.
Okay, look, tell me about the gap. Because the Met Office told us in their written evidence that there were important knowledge gaps to be addressed, including trend in Antarctic sea ice and the large uncertainties in the response to the ice sheet to future greenhouse gas emissions. So how are we, in terms of the scientific program here, give me an idea of not just, we know what we are doing, what is it that you see we need to be involved in doing, and I don't say we need to do it all ourselves, but need to be involved in doing to get a much more coherent and comprehensive scientific program in place?
So Jane may be able to help me. I had not heard that. I've spent quite a lot of time in the Met Office, and in general, people are very complimentary about the work of the British Antarctic Survey.
That's taken for rent. I think people are complimentary about what is being done, but they're conscious that there's much more that needs to be.
That's very fair.
Perhaps Ms. Rumble would like
Jane may have some somewhat contributions on that.
Yeah, sorry, I was answering a different question. Could you just summarise?
Sorry, sure. I'm asking you, what are the gaps?
Right.
There's a lot of things that we're doing. There's a lot of things that we're doing very well. But looking at the science overall, what are the issues that we need to be focused on for the future? What are the projects that really need to be brought together? This is not necessarily something that we have to do on our own, because so much of the research, and we've heard this time and again, has to be collaborative. But looking forward, persuade us, I'm asking you, that there is a really coherent view about how our science should be contributing to the overall scientific endeavour.
Sorry, there will be a division shortly in the main chamber. So what I'll do is a moment suspend the committee, and we will suspend for 15 minutes if it's one vote, or 25 minutes if it's two, thereafter 10 minutes more if it's more than that. We think it will be no more than two, and therefore we'll spend for 25 minutes. It will take us through to 10 to 5.
Lots of time to think of the answer.
Perfect, thank you.
No order.
The proceeding is currently suspended. 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 The proceeding...
Which is a great shame, although perhaps we won't miss him. But nonetheless, disappointing that he isn't able to be here for the rest of the session, particularly because we were moving on to discuss science. However, let's do what we can. Barry.
No, Chair, it's actually from Ms. Rumble. She was just about to respond to the question, so I'll give it straight to her.
Yes, thank you. You were talking about kind of how the sort of future gaps of science is determined. So it's done both at the international level and at the national level. So at the international level, there's the Scientific Committee of Antarctic Research, which is an international body. They have done a horizon scan, and they kind of keep that up to date in terms of what does the science community think the future challenges that need to be addressed are. And then that body can help deliver kind of international cooperative science, getting everybody to work together. And then at the national level, the British Antarctic Survey have done a kind of gap analysis of science. They pointed to things like enhancing climate modelling, conserving biodiversity, protecting their infrastructure, looking at the global implications of Antarctic science, and then also looking at trigger points. So in the polar regions, there are some of the big trigger points. These are things that will shift the global system that won't be reversible. And once they go, there's a question of will that cascade? So trying to understand the modelling of that is very key. And then also trying to look at and predict extreme events in the polar regions, because they can also have a sort of significant impact. So,
good. Look, let me ask you though about the shifts and the progress in technology and equipment, because we heard from Mike Bentley, who's professor at Durham University, that as the science is changing, more vehicles, sensors, more sophisticated engineering is available, and clearly we need access to that to be able to move forward and fill those gaps that you've just identified. How are we going about doing that to make sure that we do actually have the kit that we need in order to get the scientific data that we'd require?
Well, one example would be some of the work we're doing on remote sensing stations in the Antarctic. We've got remote operated vehicles, and we've got remote personnel aviation systems, and we're looking at how we can utilise AI capabilities as well. So we're working hard to update these technologies. I'm sure the Minister can provide more information as required, but
he was here.
And we are also, I think the other thing that's key is making sure that whatever we take forward and other countries do as well, that they're within appropriate guidelines and operating protocols to maintain compliance with the treaty provisions.
Okay. If I can ask you about one of the projects, the InSync project, and how you envisage that feeding into the International Polar Year in 2032. InSync, I think, is concluding, it goes between 27 and 30, doesn't it?
Right.
Yeah. So, again, what specific measures is the government taking to support that project, and how do you see it feeding into the Antarctic?
Yeah, it's going to help deliver the circumpolar assessment. We heard already from the Science Minister about DCIT's commitment to support this and the government more widely. And it's going to be really important to help work out the connections between the ice, ocean, atmosphere, climate, environment and life, including human pressures. We've got the preparatory work that's taking place between 24 and 27, and then you're absolutely right, Barry. Then the synchronous, not an easy thing to say, scientific observations will then take place between 27 and 30, and that will then build up to the International Polar Year. I'll be interested in the...
And it's really important that we're taking the same measures at the same time and doing that regularly, isn't it?
Yes. And we have to do it through international collaboration. That's the key thing. And I know that's come up in quite a few of the questions that we've been discussing today. But international collaboration is key, and the treaty, helps encourage that as well. All I would say, though, I think we'd all look and say, because I keep looking at 2032, and that's a long way off. And when you look at some of the very dire projections about what can happen in the Antarctic, I think this is an important project, but it's very clear that we need to be doing a lot more work, both in terms of science and also mitigation in the years that approach that as well. The International Polar Year can't just be about this project. There's a lot more work that needs to be done. I'm sure the committee would have a view on that as well.
Yeah, no, thank you. That's clear. Look, before we move on to specifically funding of science, I wanted to ask you about how we're ensuring that we're in compliance with the Nagoya Protocol, and specifically the promotion of fair and equitable sharing of benefits that come from the genetic resources in the Antarctic, which of course is part of the protocol. Now, under the EU, we had Regulation 511/2014, which I'm sure you're familiar with. I'm assuming that was rolled over under REAL, and that we now have it as part of our own domestic law. So what are we actually doing to ensure that compliance is there? to make sure that there is that equitable sharing of the genetic resources.
Okay with you, I'll ask Jane to answer that question. It's quite a technical one.
Yeah, so the Antarctic Treaty Consultative Meeting have made several statements to say that the conservation and use of genetic material in Antarctica is within the competence of the ATS. So the Convention of Biological Diversity, where the Nagoya Protocol stems from, does not apply in Antarctica by virtue of the treaty. So the treaty has controlled access to Antarctica through the Environmental Protocol. There is not yet agreement on any benefit sharing regime. It has been discussed, but there are different views about whether or not that should take place. Like, the treaty tries not to make money out of Antarctica in general terms because we're looking after it for peace and science. So, for example,
there have been patents. If you go back to I think the 1970s, the Russians did the black yeast. The Germans much more recently have done the green algae, and they've patented those. So my question then becomes, what enforcement measures have or can be taken? I accept what you say, that the Nagoya Protocol is not considered within scope under the treaty, but if there is a violation of the treaty itself in that respect, what enforcement mechanisms are there then to be put in place, and how have we done that?
So the treaty, as I say, is controlling going into Antarctica. So your collection of your genetic material is controlled by the treaty. Once you've taken it out of Antarctica, the future use of it and any kind of intellectual property and results and patents that you might get from that is not currently controlled by the treaty. There's been no agreement to have a kind of benefit sharing regime. So there is a data bank. In fact, the United Nations Environment Programme gathered a database that the UK supported some years ago to show what all of the patents are in respect of Antarctic genetic material. But the treaty, as I say, there are many parties that are concerned that we are the custodials of Antarctica. We're looking after it on behalf of the global community. We don't seek to make money out of it. We don't charge tourism licenses. We don't charge fishing licenses. So this is another kind of economic derivative of Antarctica that is not kind of controlled at this point, but the debate is quite live, and I think the recent agreement on biodiversity beyond national jurisdiction under the United Nations Law of the Sea framework, I think we have put a paper into the next meeting to kind of welcome that, and its assurance that it won't undermine regional agreements to protect the competence of the treaty. But I think
BBNJ wouldn't actually apply to the Antarctic, though, would it?
Because
it's not beyond national jurisdiction.
Exactly.
Because we have sovereign...
Exactly, but there are other states that may not take that view. The treaty puts the question of territorial sovereignty in abeyance.
One side,
so, so we're trying to reassert the message that the treaty is the competent body and that the treaty should make decisions related to the genetic use of Antarctic materials.
Given that our view is that we have sovereignty over a part of the Antarctic, why have we chosen not to exercise sovereignty rights for accessing genetic resources in the Antarctic?
Well, because the treaty puts territorial issues kind of to one side, it doesn't deny the existence of it. So we control British national activity, and within the Antarctic Act, in 2013, actually, we revised the legislation, seeing that the use of genetic materials was coming over the horizon, to ensure that we basically we give permits to collection of anything in Antarctica. So we know who's going to get it, we know how they're going to go and get it, we then know what they're going to do with it. We haven't gone one further to try to have an independent regime of benefit sharing because people would just do it in other countries. You need to have a sort of fair playing field. So we have been keeping the debate alive within the treaty, but at the moment there is, as I say, there's no great desire from any state to have a kind of benefit sharing regime, but I think that will be further debated.
Is that like saying that anybody can come into the shop, but if they shoplift and then go out, once they're out of the shop, we can't do anything about it?
Well, I suppose I would say that we control the shopping. But yes, if you go home and you put it in the bin or you eat it or you give it away, we don't control that.
And you don't control whether they then exercise a patent over it and then monetize it.
Exactly.
But I think, if I'm not mistaken, the protocol does create this sort of ceiling. It may not be exactly where you want to go, Barry, on that, but you can't take living organisms that would affect its abundance. Is that right?
That's right. Yeah.
So there's a ceiling on what you can take, and so far, that has not been abused. But clearly, we need to keep very close to this. It's vitally important.
I think it'd be really interesting to hear from you, perhaps in greater depth, Chair, in writing, just how we propose to go about tackling this. I'm really interested that you've said that BBNJ is something that you've had, you've taken into consideration in future negotiations. But I think this is an absolutely critical area, and clearly there's going to be divergence amongst different parties to the Antarctic Treaty as to how they go about it and what they do. So is there a forward-looking group of which we're part or in the lead? How are we corralling the right way forward here is something I'd be very interested to get the department's thoughts on. So if I can now turn to the funding of science in the Antarctic. If we look at the NERC grants, they're typically between £4 and £5 million. And we've certainly heard that something like the Thwaites Glacier project was something which took decades of planning and required significantly more funding. Are we in danger of having too short funding cycles, so 3 to 5 years being our sort of maximum cycle, when actually the planning and implementation of some of the really important projects here needs much, much bigger scale and much, much longer term planning?
Yeah, with your permission, given that the Science Minister isn't here, I'll endeavour to answer these questions, but between us, Jane and I will do our best to answer. If we need any further information, we'll write, but hopefully you can...
Yes, by all means,
right.
And if there are bits you don't know about, ask the Science Minister to write to the committee in response to the question, if you will.
Absolutely. So I think that's an important question around around these projects, and obviously these projects are conducted in a very harsh environment with a limited window often for them to be conducted, and that means that there needs to be longer planning times, and we do need a longer term view. Ultimately, that's going to be a matter for DSIC to decide. Some of these projects will involve international collaboration where we'll need to work with other partners as well. But we do need a longer term view, and I think the good news is, from the core funding, NERC has been there to support BAS over many years, and will continue to provide that base funding. And then in the spirit of that, the competitive bidding that goes in for funding, we'll need to make sure that there's a very clear case that some of these projects will be longer term than in other areas. But Jane, you may want to come in on some of that.
Yeah, I think there are two kind of key elements really. There is long-term investment in the BAS infrastructure, which includes some of the monitoring that they need for kind of longer-term data set collection. That's part of their kind of annual funding. There are 3-year grant opportunities. But yes, I think that is one of the challenges that the scientists face. Something, for example, for InSync, the UK wants to be involved in it. It's extremely important, but the funding round for that kind of will come in the next funding round of government. So it is quite challenging to make commitments now when.
Yeah, can I disentangle two things here, because I think it's important. One is the short-term nature of the funding that we give, the 3 to 5 years, as opposed to the decade-long projects. and the scale of funding that therefore is required. So instead of 3 to 5 million, maybe looking at 10 to 15 if it's a longer term project. That's one issue. The other is the issue that you've sort of adverted to when you were talking about collaboration. And it is very difficult to get these collaborative projects to conception, because each country is applying a national procedure to the funding that they're going to put into it, and therefore 7 out of 8 countries might all agree and give, but actually the final country might not. Don't we need actually a better mechanism for these international collaborative projects to find agreement, so that perhaps setting up a body that could be accepted by each of those countries to then deliberate on the efficacy and the value of those projects and the scale of them. But it seems to me these are separate questions. They're very much interrelated, but they are separate questions. One's about the mechanism for agreeing international collaborative projects. The other is whether we are thinking in terms of the scale and the time scale, the time frame that we need in order to get these really big projects off the ground.
Well, one thing which is slightly tangential but important to hopefully underpin your concerns about the long-term view. I mean, I think despite some challenge from the Chair and others about the amount of investment, is it enough, is it too much, we're making some big investments in science here, and I think what that should reassure the committee is that we're in here for the long haul, and I think that is a view that's held across the House, certainly across the committee from conversations we've had in the Antarctic. So that hopefully underpins the point about being here for the long term. We need to get the science return on that capital investment. And the other thing, just to clarify, is that we don't need consensus to get this collaboration going. So this collaboration could be between two countries. So I recently was in Chile. Many of you were in Chile. I think you met with the science body there. And I signed a continuation of our collaboration agreement for science in the Antarctic. So we can do good science on a bilateral basis, on multi-country basis. It doesn't have to be consensus, though. InSync's going to require a huge amount of collaboration, but we can collaborate at different levels depending on the type of science that we need to do.
I'm pleased by the optimistic and progressive way you're talking about it, Minister. We heard from Professor Bentley. He said that while funders have got better at making bilateral funding arrangements, the multilateral arrangements are quite tricky to pull off. And he explained that there's quite often double, triple, quadruple jeopardy in things being reviewed simultaneously in different countries. So it's that structural mechanism that I think... Now, normally I would be asking the witness whether they thought it was a positive recommendation that the committee put into its report, but I can't very well ask a government minister if he wants us to recommend to himself what we should be saying. But
it hasn't stopped the Chair on other questions.
Well, absolutely. But can I put it this way? Do you see the problem that Professor Bentley has outlined? And do you think it important that we should try and address those issues at a structural level?
Yeah, I can see the challenge. I think there are structural challenges that are probably more challenging now, but there are mechanisms that we've used over years, and you may want to talk about that, Jane, about how we've got through some of these challenges in the past.
Yes, I might suggest that we have DSIT to write, but my understanding is that there are some countries with whom we have a kind of double jeopardy agreement, or we certainly did have. So with the United States, for example, where we've got very similar processes of science, there's an agreement if one funds, the other will just kind of take that. Yes, there's indeed a similar agreement with the Norwegians. But you're right, there is a real challenge, and quite often international collaborations work because you've got one party that really takes the lion's share of it, and then others kind of dock in where and if they can, and the sort of the equality of overall funding can fall down with certain members not being able to join. I think the way that the scientists go about it is try to not have to have a single point of failure in their grant bids, so that people can kind of come and join if they can do. But I think the challenge that you've set out is real.
Thank you. Look, let me move to the other side of the equation now and talk about how government assesses the effectiveness and the efficiency of their spending on research and logistics in Antarctica. You have the Antarctic Infrastructure Modernisation Programme. That's £670 million on polar infrastructure. How is the government assessing the effectiveness and efficiency of that programme?
Well, on this, we will need to get some written responses from DZIT in terms of, because I know the laser-like focus that you have been giving to this issue, so we will do that. But strategically, is it enabling us to fulfil the dual function of BAS's role, which we talked about at the very beginning? That's going to be key, and it will do, based on what we see now in terms of the infrastructure. And then, does it help inform our science, and does it help cement our place in providing and continuing to provide world-leading Antarctic science? There'll be key questions, certainly from our perspective. In terms of individual projects, NERC and UKRI will have their own criteria on that.
Right. Okay, finally, if I can just pay tribute to what has been done in the Blue Belt programme. I think it's one of the most significant, one of the most important things that the government has done, not just in environmental policy, but at all. I think it's fantastic. You're anticipating a but, and the but is this. The programme post-2025 isn't yet funded. And perhaps you could tell us when we are going to have certainty about its post-25 funding, and make me even more praising your administration for the generosity of that post-25 funding.
Yeah, well, I think it's fair to say that there isn't certainty on funding for all government programmes beyond 2025. There is going to be, no doubt, new CSR and a review of funding overall, but our ambition on Blue Belt is very clear, and thanks for the tributes, but I think it's also the fact that there's such huge support in Parliament for this that just helps give weight to the need to take this work forward. We've seen real successes through the Blue Belt programme, not just in the Antarctic but also in the overseas territories. But in the Antarctic this year, it's going to support the review of the South Orkney Southern Shelf MPA, which is going to be good. It will support the development of a new State of the Southern Ocean report. There's going to be penguin monitoring in South Orkneys, which obviously, given everything we talked about today, is going to be key. And we'll continue to support climate change monitoring, test new radar technology to support fisheries patrols. Any government will want to continue that work, given the weight of the impact of the things we're considering today. So we can't make complete commitments in terms of the absolute spend, but I think everybody in this room would realise that we need to continue to support this programme fully and wholeheartedly. It's mission critical.
And indeed to expand it under BBNJ. Thank you very much.
Sticking this slightly, you may have answered this partly already. Given the complex structure, DSIT to UCREED to NERC to BAS, and given that the government have announced, for example, that we're going to cut 76,000 civil servants in order to pay for the 2.5% of defence spending, what guarantee does BAS have that they won't find huge cuts in their budget one year? Is there any? What is the mechanism that allows BAS to be reasonably certain that their funding will be maintained?
Well, again, that's going to have to be a question for the Science Minister. But I think, again, when we look at the scale of the investment that we've made in polar science and in Antarctic science in particular in terms of capital investment, it's obvious that there's going to be an important and continuing role for BAS to play.
Of course, but I mean, you see what I mean. With our CRADE in particular being a huge organisation now with 3,000 civil servants in it, and now, you know, there's BAS are at the bottom of the heap, aren't they? BAS might well lose out from some government spending cut programme.
I personally would never regard BAS at the bottom of the heap. I think they
that structure.
They punch well above their weight internationally.
But
Chair, you tempt me. You tempt me too much, and I cannot speak beyond my competence.
Okay. Let me move on to ask some serious questions about infrastructure. And before I do so, can I just say I think the committee as a whole are immensely impressed by the infrastructure all round. I think our voyage on the SDA and what we saw at Rothera, you know, is extremely impressive. So I wouldn't want my questions to be interpreted as being negative in one way or another. But nonetheless, it's right that we ask them. What are we doing about the fact that because it's taken so long to rebuild Rothera, there are significant gaps in the science? The science is being delayed because we saw for ourselves one very small little lab and really huge quantities of accommodation, but really not much scientific activity going on at all. So the science in Rothera is being delayed because of the infrastructure. What's the government going to do about that?
Well, it's been delayed not just because of infrastructure, it's been delayed partly because of COVID as well, and also the weather. So there has been some cancellation of projects or postponement. But as we saw, and as you've highlighted, the infrastructure is now being built to a really high quality, and that will ensure that we've got scientific capability for decades to come. So we'll be in a better place. Sometimes, you know, when you create new infrastructure, it can cause disruption or changes to plans, but then you're in a better place to conduct those activities going forward. And clearly, from a logistics perspective, we'll be in a far greater place once the runway's completed and once that infrastructure is in place in the near future.
Can we focus for a moment on the State Admiral herself? We heard that she's currently being used. Of course, as background, of course, we went down from 2 ships working with BAS down to 1. And partly as a result of that, we heard that 70% of her time is being used for logistics, for shifting crew and that kind of thing, and 30% for scientific research. A, is that correct? And B, if so, surely that's a very strange way to use hundreds of millions of pounds worth of scientific research vessel.
Yeah, I'll let James come on to some of the technical point or the numbers there that you asked. But just to be clear, that BAS has also got the freedom to charter additional support, and they have used that with cargo vessels helping to support the building infrastructure programme. So it's not just about one vessel, although there has been a change clearly from 2 to 1. There is extra capacity that can be used as appropriate.
Of course, that's true, but nonetheless, previously you'd have a ship which does logistics largely, and carts people and equipment and supplies around, and the scientific ship does the science. Whereas now the SDA is doing both. And for example, I remember I was very impressed by seeing the moon pool when I went to visit the ship when she was first up in London here last year. But of course, when we were on board, the moon pool was totally covered in cargo and it couldn't be used even if we wanted to, because of tons of stuff on top of it. You know, I just wonder whether or not, and a number of people we spoke to were firmly of the view that the ship was not really being used for the purpose for which she was built. She was being used largely for logistical purposes.
Well, on the 70-30 split, we'll have to come back to you, Chair, through DZIT. We don't know that figure. Clearly, there's a dual use, and there'll be different times at which it carries out a supply function and a science function. That's clear in terms of its requirements. But you know, we'll see this year, and I know you'll be delighted in this, with SDA going to Greenland. You know, it's showing that it can go outside of what might have been more traditional roles before, and we'll be able to carry out a really good science function there, without a doubt. We're
glad about that, although our report, of course, originally asked for, we hoped the ship would go to the North Pole. which at least is theoretically possible. What a great thing that would be. But I'm glad she's going to Greenland and doing a bit of work there. Nonetheless, how do you see the role of the SDA? Is she a scientific research vessel, or is she a support vessel for BAS operations in Antarctica?
Well, and it also has an important role, one which we talked about on the visit, in terms of soft power as well, in terms of helping people appreciate the science that we're able to do and its implications as well. So I think it's got a multifaceted role, and it needs to do both of those things. I mean, that's the point. We've got one vessel now rather than two, and so it needs to do both those functions.
We also heard from the Falklands government that they were concerned that the Pharos is being used excessively to resupply BAS bases in South Georgia because of this going down from two ships down to one ship. Does that ring any bells?
I'm afraid not. Again, we can take a look at that question and come back to
that, because the Falklanders will view that the Pharos was being used unreasonably for BAS, Bird Island and Cape that thing. King basically, and that therefore she was not being used sufficiently for their purposes. But yeah, perhaps you might want to look into that a little bit. All right, fine. Finally, I'm puzzled slightly by the precise relationship with HMS Protector. She's there. She's not armed. She is flying the red ensign. What's she for, and what's the relationship with BAS and with the government?
Well, Protector, it's the Royal Navy's ice patrol ship, obviously, and it's deployed in the South Atlantic and Antarctic during the austral summer. She upholds the UK's commitment to the Antarctic Treaty and provides valuable logistic support to both BAS, as we saw, and also to the UK Antarctic Heritage Trust through supply drops and the transportation of personnel and goods. She also undertakes hydrographic surveys in the region, contributing to the safety of navigation in an area that's not been widely mapped. So Protector's presence benefits UK science, and in this past season she carried 2 scientists from Oceanites, a US-UK penguin monitoring foundation, enabling them to survey penguin colony populations. But Protector also carries out another role. It's a white ensign British sovereign vessel, and this is critical to demonstrating our sovereignty over the British Antarctic territory, and also to South Georgia and the South Sandwich Islands. As the UK's only ice-class defence asset, she plays a vital role in supporting the UK in Antarctica. So there's multiple roles.
So who pays for
her? MOD.
MOD. So the MOD are paying for scientists and for oceanographic surveying and for all sorts of things. Nothing whatever to do with defence of the realm, is it?
Well, there are elements of that, but it also carries out other functions as well, supply and the other sovereign vessel.
Supply to BAS bases, not supply to military bases. I mean, the purpose of the military defence's job is to defend the realm and to kill the Queen's enemies, King's enemies. This ship seems to me to be being used for BAS functions, for scientific functions, for a variety of functions, but not actually for defence functions at all. And indeed, under the treaty, it's not allowed to be used for defence functions.
Yeah, but I think it's also important that it carries out a role about protecting our interests. And another key interest...
Hang on, what interest?
Well, let me just finish the sentence.
Yeah, sorry,
mind.
Sorry.
Protecting our interests. No problem. It's your committee. Protecting our interests, one of which, as I highlighted, is our sovereignty.
Protecting our sovereignty.
Protecting our interests, one of our key interests in the Antarctic, as we talked about right at the beginning and throughout, is this dual issue around sovereignty and science, our presence.
Are we content if other nations had military vessels in Antarctica protecting their sovereignty? Would we be content with that?
There are other countries that have permanent presence there, yeah. I mean, you look at what's going on with both Chile and Argentina.
Yes, America doesn't, does it, or does it? Military vessels? No. Chile and Argentina do, and we do. Okay. But also, isn't it odd that the MOD budget's so much under stress, and we're trying to increase the spend to 2.5% of GDP, and we're going to fire 76,000 civil servants. But here's an MOD vessel being used for functions which actually are for BAS or for science and come under DCIT. They don't come under MOD at all.
Well, as I said, there are commitments that we've made under the Antarctic Treaty, and HMS Protector helps us with those functions. So, I understand the thrust of your question, Chair, but I think what we're trying to do here is obviously use our assets to carry out a range of roles, and the funding streams need to come through different departments, but they enable us to achieve our objectives.
I'm told there's another vote imminent, and therefore let's move straight on to question 8. Hi.
Very much, Chair. Hello, David.
Hi.
When we were out in the Antarctic, we obviously travelling on the Slave at Attenborough, not so much at Rothera, we did see a lot of shipping and a lot of tourism. So I wanted to know what the government were doing in terms of the rapid growth in the tourism industry in this area. Whether you thought that those operators could self-regulate, or does it require more policing and more regulation?
Yeah, I think it's a really interesting question, and as you say, there were a number of vessels there in a very sensitive area, and they often focus, understandably, because of the amazing environment there around the Antarctic Peninsula. So we believe that it's important to regulate tourism through the Antarctic Treaty and the Environmental Protocol. In addition, most of the tour operators are members of the International Association of Antarctic Tour Operators. And this includes providing practical management tools within the self-regulatory framework to ensure that members work together effectively to provide practical mutual support in things like search and rescue as well. But coming to the point that you're making, it's clear that tourism is growing in popularity, and new operators can't be mandated to join IATO. And that's why the UK is advocating for a development of a comprehensive tourism framework. Yeah. I just wanted to get that on the record before we get caught up in any votes. Sorry, I'm skipping through things, but I wanted to make sure we got that on the record. And and that needs to be agreed at an Antarctic Treaty consultative meeting. But tourism needs to be safe, responsible, and clearly sustainable.
And how do you police that then? It's obviously because if you bring this new robust legal framework in, how would it be policed? I mean, obviously,
it needs to be brought into place first.
Yes,
it carry
does.
on.
Yeah, so that's a great start, but clearly making sure that operators who are operating for a profit, one would presume, are going to do as is required. How do we ensure they're going to do that? Because obviously lots of shortcuts could be taken. And
yeah, if you don't mind, I'm going to ask Jane to come in here because she deals with these issues day in, day out.
Yeah, so at the moment, every tourist vessel will have some kind of permit or authorisation from its national competent authority, and that competent authority will determine what kind of sanctions. So there have been examples of non-compliant vessels being denied future permits or being fined. The proposal that we put forward to have an international regime is that would make it a more of a level playing field. Then you'd be breaching international law, not just up to a state party to determine what sanction it took against a vessel. So it would try to make it more of an onus on the state, the flag state or the competent authority state that authorise the activity to take action.
It's one thing to be on a sea vessel, a seagoing vessel, looking at the Antarctic. Is another thing to go on land. Do you think being on land, on the actual, given the kind of sensitive nature of the Antarctic, many of the unique species that are there, do you think it's right that people should be able to go on to the Antarctic? Can that be policed? Can that be looked after in the way that's required, that's necessary?
If I could pay tribute to some of the work that Jane's done over the years, which I think is very well respected. We saw that in our travels. We helped to introduce the concept of site guidelines to the treaty system to support safe and consistent and well-managed visits to those sites. But you're right, that these things have to be monitored and reviewed. But again, Jane, anything you want to add to that? I think you've been doing some important work there.
Yeah, I would. Yes, I mean it to my view, my kind of personal view, is that the people seeing Antarctica is more likely to make them engaged in wanting to protect it. So, why should a scientist get to go ashore and a tourist can't? That said, it's got to be extremely well managed. We don't want to love Antarctica to death. So we need to make sure that everybody who is making a landing abides by the rules, and that's going to hopefully be part of the regulatory framework. We don't, at this point, have significant evidence of environmental impact of tourists landing, but obviously there's a lot of monitoring to make sure that that remains the case, and that sites are properly managed and closed if you get any kind of adverse human impact.
Some countries play nicer than others, don't they? So we know that the US and other countries have not ratified key agreements related to Antarctic tourism. What's the British government doing diplomatically to try and bring them to the table and to get them to sign?
Well, we're working with them, but on a bilateral basis, to encourage countries to do this. You're right, the US has got an important role here, no question about that, given the weight of tourism from US vessels. That said, I think most tourism operators do sign up to these and implement these approaches on a meaningful way, so that's a good thing, but that needs to continue. And that's why I just wanted again to come back to this framework which you talked about. It was clear at the last ATCM meeting about the Antarctic Treaty, the consultative meeting, that we were able to start negotiations on a comprehensive framework. But at the next ATCM, which is, as we said before, in May, the UK submitted a suggested outline framework and potential elements to be included in this sort of framework. And we've got support working with Finland, France, Germany, India, and the Netherlands on this. So I think there's a bilateral engagement piece here, but there's also a multilateral one. And I think the committee would wish Jane well with these conversations. I certainly do. To hope we can make further progress, and hopefully more of the consultative parties will get behind some of these other countries as well.
Do you know the kind of main stumbling blocks and why the US haven't signed up to these treaties?
I think the issue is that there are different processes. I'll let Jane say this, but what I have learned through working with the US is they have a different approach to signing off treaties, and there can be challenges in Congress, but I don't know enough about this particular treaty.
I think that's largely it.
So, finally, turning to kind of UK tour operators, site guidelines can be quite critical for ensuring the kind of safe provision of tourism in those Antarctic areas. What is the government doing with British tour operators to ensure that they adhere to those site guidelines and comply with them as well?
Can you talk about that, Jane?
Yeah, so our main operators are Noble Caledonia, Arctic Trucks, White Desert. We're about to take HX Expeditions, which was Hurtigruten. All of those are members of the International Association of Antarctica Tour Operators. The original site guidelines actually were written in conjunction with the person who is now the boss of the Antarctic program of Noble Caledonia. So we're very happy that our operators are very... they engage with us very closely. They're very keen. In fact, they would like to see more site guidelines developed. So far we have good compliant operators.
Thank you. Chair?
Well, the timing is absolutely brilliant. Thank you very much indeed. Can I just say, first of all, thank you to both of you, David Rutley and Jane Rumble, for the evidence you've given this afternoon, but more important than that, for the great cooperation which you've given us on a visit to Antarctica, and going back before that, right into the Arctic inquiry before. I think the level of cooperation and help we've had from the Foreign Office and from BAS has been quite exceptional. We really are extraordinarily grateful to you for it, and to a lesser extent perhaps for the DCIT Science Minister. We're glad that he was here too. So thank you very much indeed for all you've done. We will be producing the report sometime between now and the summer recess, so within the next couple of months. If you think of other things that you'd like us to have in there, but you haven't thought to get, or you haven't managed to get into the evidence this afternoon, do please write in and we'll seek to add things as they go along. And I hope that the report, when you see it eventually, you'll view as being both well informed, questioning, but nonetheless useful and helpful to the overall approach to science and geopolitics in Antarctica. So thank you very, very much indeed for your evidence, which has been extremely helpful.
Thank you. And if I may just say something briefly, because we all have to dash in a second. As I said at the beginning, very grateful for the constructive challenge here. I think we all recognise there are key equities that we need to consider and move forward. So the point that was made about the Antarctic strategy, I think, is going to be key, and the report from the committee will be an important, depending on the timing, but I think it will make it to be considered into the strategy that we published in the autumn. So I think the timing works well, the sequencing works well, and thank you for the huge amount of work, and also for the work the clerks have been doing as well.
Yes,
because it has been genuinely epic. It's been really difficult to organise all this, and we're delighted in FCDO in your interest and the way that this agenda is being moved forward cross-party. Thank you.
I think you're right. It's probably the one last time in Hansard we actually see Dawn Amy, particularly with regard to the writing of it all and the questions and the production of briefs, and Rebecca Lees have both been absolutely outstanding assistants, and indeed our learned assistants, advisors. But thank you to both of you for the fantastic work you've done. Thank you all. Order.
The proceeding has ended. 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 The proceeding has ended.